You stand in the dim corridor of a palace that has outlived dynasties. The air is thick, unmoving, carrying the faint smell of dust and old wood polish. Far ahead, a single door waits, narrow, unadorned, its surface worn smooth by countless hands that opened it without ceremony. A shadow passes across your path. A woman in plain dress, her head bowed, her steps hurried. In her hand, a ring of keys clinks softly, too softly for a place where doors are meant to be open. She reaches the door, turns the key with practiced precision, and slips inside without a word. From where you stand, you hear it. A faint whimper, high and trembling. The sound of a life too young to understand what is happening. The woman steps back out. In her eyes there is no malice, only the heaviness of someone performing a duty that must never be spoken of. She turns the key again, this time from the outside. A lock clicks into place. Inside the room, the air is colder. The curtains are drawn tight against the daylight. In the corner sits a cradle draped in silk, the once bright fabric dulled with time. No toys are scattered on the floor, no lullaby hums in the air. The only movement is the slight rise and fall of a small chest beneath the blankets. There is no name stitched into the bedding, no family crest above the door. This is a royal child, yet nothing in this room claims them. Beyond these walls, their existence will not be acknowledged. No official record will bear witness to them. In the annals of history, they will be as if they never drew breath. The silence here is deliberate. It is the kind of silence that can stretch across centuries, swallowing faces and names until nothing remains but rumors. And as you stand in that doorway, you begin to understand. This is not a place for the living to grow. It is a place for them to disappear. Why? Because this child was born with Down syndrome. And for the rulers of this palace, for monarchies across time, such a child was not to be celebrated or even pitied. They were to be hidden, erased, locked away from the gaze of the world to preserve the illusion of perfection. This is the story of those children, the ones whose blood carried crowns but whose names were denied the dignity of memory. The children who were born into palaces but sentenced to live in shadows. The children history was never meant to remember. If you believe no child's name should vanish from history, prove it. Subscribe now. If you won't, at least explain in the comments why their stories should stay buried. Royal power did not rest solely on armies or gold. It was built on image. Monarchies survived because people believed their rulers were chosen by God, set apart from ordinary humanity. A king's body, a queen's face, a prince's bearing, all were symbols of divine favor. Every child born to the throne was more than an heir. They were a living promise that the bloodline was pure, the dynasty unbreakable, the kingdom blessed. But in an age when perfection was the currency of power, even the smallest difference could be seen as a fracture in the crown itself. In medieval and early modern courts, a child born with visible or cognitive differences was not simply a medical case, they were a political crisis. To the minds of the time, disability was rarely understood as nature's variation. It was interpreted as a curse, a bad omen, or a punishment from God for sins committed by the parents or the entire realm. Chroniclers wrote of malformed infants as signs of approaching war, famine, or divine wrath. Priests preached that such births were reminders of humanity's fallen state. Without the knowledge of genetics, every deviation from the expected was grouped together. Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, muscular disorders, none of these names existed. They were simply monstrous births or freaks of nature. Words that stripped the child of humanity and turned them into a warning. In 15th century France, a prince born with an unknown condition was described in the court journal only once. His name never written again after the day of his birth. In the Holy Roman Empire, an archduke's daughter who could not speak clearly or walk without assistance was said to be taken into the service of God, a polite fiction that meant she was cloistered for life. In Tudor England, whispers surrounded a noble infant born lacking wit, and before the child's first year, they vanished from the royal household entirely. These were not isolated cases. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, royal records reveal patterns. Children who appeared in baptism ledgers but never in coronation rolls. heirs who disappeared between the lines of history. The court would not announce their deaths because for the world beyond the palace, they had never truly lived. If you believe those lives deserve to be remembered, subscribe so more people hear the truth. If you think the silence was justified, write your reason in the comments and let the world see it. In the winter of 1887, the bells of Munich rang to announce the birth of Princess Hildegard of Bavaria. The city celebrated as snow fell across the rooftops, and the court proclaimed her arrival as another blessing upon the royal line. Her name appeared in the official ledgers, her baptism recorded with the same flourish as generations before her. But within the walls of the palace, the mood was different. The nurses noticed early that Hildegard did not meet their expectations. Her eyes had the gentle upward curve now recognized as a feature of Down syndrome. Her hands were small, her movements slower, her muscles softer. She laughed often, but her speech came haltingly. In a court where every detail of a child's development was charted like a military campaign, these signs were not seen as individuality, they were seen as imperfection. In the court records of the following year, a single word began to follow her name, Schwach, the German for weak. By the time she was 3, that word had been replaced with kranklich, sickly. It was a label, not a diagnosis, and it became the only identity the official history allowed her. On her 5th birthday, the record stops. There is no mention of a death, no royal funeral, no memorial. The chronicles simply move on, as though she had never existed. The truth emerged decades later, buried in the estate papers of a Bavarian count. Among the inventories and land transfers was a reference to a Lady Hildegard, residing at a countryside manor, her expenses covered by the royal treasury. The manor was not a grand palace but a secluded estate surrounded by forests, far from the capital. It was staffed with a handful of attendants and governed by a matron who reported directly to the royal household. Hildegard lived there the rest of her life, receiving care but never again seen in public. She was not permitted to attend court functions, not even the weddings or funerals of her own siblings. Her likeness was never painted, her name never spoken in public by the family that had once celebrated her birth. This was not merely isolation, it was deliberate erasure. The palace could have cared for her openly, could have allowed her to remain a visible part of the royal story. Instead, she became a living ghost, sustained by royal wealth but cut away from royal identity. The bloodline was preserved on paper, but her branch was clipped from the tree. If you're still watching and you think she deserved to be remembered, hit subscribe. If not, tell the world why she deserved silence. The disappearance of a royal child was rarely announced in blunt terms. Courts understood the power of words, and they chose them carefully, not to reveal the truth, but to bury it. In palace records, certain phrases became a language of erasure. Of delicate health was among the most common. It suggested frailty without detail, a gentle veil over the reality that the child would never appear in public again. In France, it was often the last note entered beside a name before it vanished from all other registers. Retired from court was another. In the Spanish Habsburg archives, this phrase appears beside the names of several princes and princesses who were alive but absent for decades. It implied voluntary withdrawal, when in truth it meant exile to an estate or cloister far from the capital. Entered religious life was perhaps the most misleading of all. In Austria and Russia, the royal chroniclers used it as a tidy explanation for children who were sent to monasteries or convents. The implication was piety, a noble choice. But in many cases, these were not choices, they were lifelong confinements decided before the child could even speak. The succession lists told their own quiet lies. Chroniclers would leap from one sibling to another as if no child had been born between them. In the Spanish Bourbon line, there are gaps where births are known to have occurred but no names are recorded. In the Romanov archives, a Tsar's younger daughter disappears entirely between census documents, her existence confirmed only by a private letter written by a governess. Across Europe, the pattern repeats. France's court almanacs, Spain's royal registers, Austria's Hofkammer records, Russia's imperial family rolls, all holding absences that are more telling than the names they preserve. The words chosen were polite, almost tender on the surface, but they served a single purpose: to ensure that the public never asked the question, what happened to this child? If you believe the truth should never be hidden behind polite lies, subscribe so these stories are heard. If you think the language of erasure was justified, say why in the comments and let history judge your answer. In 1919, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon was born into the British aristocracy, a first cousin to the future Queen Elizabeth II. 7 years later, her sister Catherine followed. To the outside world, the Bowes-Lyons were part of the glittering web of the Windsor dynasty, connected to its power, wealth, and prestige. But the moment these two girls showed signs of severe intellectual disability, their future within that world began to vanish. Officially, the family declared them to be of delicate health. Unofficially, a decision was made. They would be removed from public life altogether. In 1941, both sisters were admitted to the Royal Oldswood Hospital in Surrey, a sprawling Victorian institution originally built for people with developmental and learning disabilities. The institution was not a place of comfort. Its wards were overcrowded, its funding stretched thin, and the patients, many of them abandoned by their families, were often left to live in monotony and isolation. For Nerissa and Catherine, the daily routine became mechanical. Meals served at rigid hours, shared dormitories with rows of identical beds, and endless hours in sparsely furnished common rooms. The most chilling detail was not where they lived, but what the family did next. In the official peerage records, Nerissa and Catherine were both listed as deceased. Nerissa in 1940, Catherine in 1961. They were alive, yet their names were marked with the finality of death. For decades, they remained in Oldswood with only rare visits from a single cousin. The rest of the family stayed away, their absence a silence louder than any public statement. To the wider public, the sisters did not exist. That silence broke in 1987, when journalists uncovered the truth. The revelation sparked outrage not only for the deception, but for what it revealed about how the British upper classes dealt with disability in the 20th century. It was not uncommon for children with intellectual disabilities to be sent to long-term institutions, often with the understanding they would never return home. But for the cousins of a reigning monarch, the act carried a sharper sting. The choice was not only about care, it was about image. Nerissa died in 1986, still a resident of Oldswood. Catherine lived until 2014, spending nearly 9 decades hidden from the public gaze. The monarchy never offered a formal explanation. The records remain corrected in the archives, but the decades of erasure cannot be undone. If hearing this makes you angry, subscribe so more people hear it. If you think these stories should stay hidden, then have the courage to say why in the comments. The practice of hiding royal children with disabilities was not confined to Europe. Across continents, the same instinct to protect the image of the throne at all costs produced eerily similar stories. In the Persian court chronicles of the Safavid and Qajar dynasties, there are scattered references to sons of the shadow and silent daughters. These were not titles of honor, but coded phrases. They marked children who, for reasons never detailed, were removed from the royal register soon after birth. In some accounts, these children were sent to distant estates under the care of trusted servants. In others, they simply vanished from the records, their lives reduced to a single ambiguous mention in the king's yearbook. The words are sparse, but the meaning is clear. They were hidden, not dead, hidden so the dynasty's claim to divine favor would remain untarnished. In Japan's imperial archives, centuries-old ledgers record the birth of princes and princesses with careful formality. Yet occasionally, the line ends with a note, sent to the mountain temple. On the surface, it reads like a noble act of religious devotion. But historians studying the patterns found that such children never returned to court and were never included in imperial ceremonies. Many lived out their days in temple care, their royal origin unspoken to the outside world. The act removed them from the succession line without the stain of scandal, cloaking exile in the robes of piety. In parts of Africa, oral histories tell of spirit children born into royal compounds, infants whose differences were interpreted as signs that they belonged to another realm. In some traditions, they were believed to bring misfortune if kept within the palace walls. While the customs varied, the outcome was often the same. These children were taken away quietly, sometimes raised by families far from the royal seat, their connection to the bloodline denied to all but a few elders. Across cultures and centuries, the motive was identical. It was not about care alone, it was about control. The image of an unbroken, perfect dynasty was more valuable to monarchs than the presence of a child who challenged that illusion. Whether in gilded European courts, Persian palaces, Japanese temples, or African compounds, the decision was the same. The world must never see them, because to see them was to see the crown's vulnerability. If you believe no throne should be worth more than the truth about a child's life, subscribe so this reality is not buried again. If you think the image of royalty is worth such a price, say why in the comments and let your reasoning stand in history. In 1928, de Gaulle was born to Charles de Gaulle, the man who would one day lead France through its darkest hours, and his wife, Yvonne. From the moment of her birth, it was clear and was different. She had the distinct features of Down syndrome, though at the time the condition was barely understood. Unlike so many children of her era, and was not sent away to an institution. She remained in the family home, surrounded by her parents' constant attention. Charles de Gaulle adored her. Photographs from the private family collection, rare and never intended for the press, show him holding her with a tenderness that rarely appeared in his public life. He played games with her, walked with her in the garden, and read to her in the quiet hours of the evening. She was the joy of her father's private world, but beyond those walls, and did not exist in the eyes of the French public. She did not accompany her family to public events. Her name was almost never mentioned in interviews or speeches. Even those who worked closely with de Gaulle in politics knew little, if anything, about her. The man who would one day address entire nations kept his daughter's life shielded from view, not out of shame, but from an understanding that the public and the press would not see her as he did. Anne's life was short. She died of pneumonia at the age of 20. Her father, a man of immense discipline and reserve, was said to have wept openly at her funeral. In her memory, Yvonne de Gaulle founded a hospital dedicated to the care of children with disabilities, a legacy of compassion that endures to this day. Yet the paradox remains. Anne was cherished in life and honored in death, but the affection that shaped her world was largely private. She was protected but also hidden. Even in the rare cases where love prevailed over the old traditions of exile, the instinct to shield a royal or prominent child from the public gaze endured. If you believe love should never be hidden, subscribe to help keep these truths in the light. If you disagree, leave your reason, let's see it. Many of these children lived and died without their full name ever being spoken beyond the walls that confined them. Their lives were measured in years, but their presence was measured in whispers, if it was measured at all. Without public acknowledgement, they left no official trace, no portraits, no inscriptions on royal memorials. They were born into dynasties that recorded every banquet and battle, yet for them, there was no record worth keeping. This erasure stripped them of more than identity. It took their place in the family's story, their rightful connection to a lineage that shaped nations. It severed them from the legacies they were born into and denied them the simple truth of being remembered. In the cold precision of the archives, it was as if they had never existed, and in the minds of future generations they never would. The cost of this silence went beyond the children themselves. By hiding them, monarchies kept the stigma of disability alive for centuries. When the most powerful families in the world treated difference as something to be concealed, the message spread far beyond palace gates. To be different was to be unworthy of being seen. One historian called it the myth of royal perfection, a story carefully cultivated to convince subjects that their rulers were not just chosen, but flawless. Perfection myths, she wrote, do not fade quietly, they rot in the foundation, and that rot spreads until it shapes the way entire societies see human worth. If we forget them again, we become part of the erasure. Subscribe to stand against it, or if you won't, say why in the comments so history knows where you stood. Today, the world these children once knew has changed. In many countries, people with Down syndrome now go to school alongside their peers. They act on stage, compete in sports, and build careers in art, education, and business. They travel, marry, and live lives full of agency. Lives that would have been unthinkable in the courts of the past. Public figures with Down syndrome stand as advocates, challenging the old lies with their presence alone. But this progress is new, measured not in centuries but in decades. Just 2 or 3 generations ago, the old pattern of concealment was still common. The laws that protect inclusion, the programs that encourage participation, these are fragile gains, vulnerable to being rolled back when economic pressures rise or political climates shift. Even now, in the most powerful families, image can still triumph over truth. There are still cases, discreet and rarely spoken of, where difference is quietly hidden away from the public gaze. The instinct to protect the facade, to maintain the illusion of perfection, has not disappeared. It has only learned to operate in more subtle ways. The lesson of history is clear. Acceptance can be lost as quickly as it is won. Without constant vigilance, the silence of the past can return. The same doors that once closed on royal children could close again, if not in palaces, then in the hearts of a society that chooses comfort over honesty. These were not just children. They were heirs, daughters, sons, human beings born into the promise of crowns and palaces, yet erased by the very hands sworn to protect them. Their lives were measured not by what they achieved, but by how completely they could be hidden. They were denied the simplest rights, to be named, to be seen, to be remembered. Behind the gilded doors of history's greatest dynasties, they were locked away, stripped of identity so the myth of perfection could endure. Their absence shaped the way entire societies viewed disability, not as a part of humanity, but as a flaw to be erased. And because they were hidden, generations grew up never questioning why. The story you've heard is not about the past alone. It's a mirror. It reflects what happens when image becomes more important than truth, when power chooses silence over compassion. And it asks a question that will outlive every throne. What is the value of a human life when it cannot serve the image others demand? Here, in Echoes of Time, our mission is to bring the forgotten back into the light. Every name spoken, every truth uncovered, is a small act of restoration. By watching, by remembering, by sharing, you help return to them what was taken, the dignity of being part of the human story. If we let them fade again, then the palace is won. The erasure worked. But if we keep their names alive, if we refuse to let silence win, we undo the lie that perfection was ever the measure of worth. Remember them, speak of them, share their stories, because the moment you do, they are no longer lost, they are ours again.